So thank you everyone for joining us today, this evening, this afternoon, wherever you may be. I'm Ester Kincová, Public Affairs and Policy Manager for the Transform Drug Policy Foundation, and also very proud to be one of the co-authors, along with Steve Rolls here, our Senior Policy Analyst, of our How to Regulate Psychedelics guide. First off, for those of you who are not aware about Transform's work, we're an independent UK-based charity currently calling from Bristol and London, working nationally and internationally towards a just and effective system of legal regulation for all drugs, and for more than 2 decades been working on global drug policy analysis and advocacy, putting forward viable alternatives to prohibition. How to Regulate Psychedelics Practical Guide is our next instalment in our ongoing book series on legally regulating drugs, following our guides on regulating cannabis, cocaine, MDMA, and amphetamines, which I urge you to go and check out as well if you haven't already. Before I start about any of the details in this book, I must extend a huge thank you to everyone who made this publication possible. All my excellent colleagues at Transform, of which some of you are here attending today. Particular shout out to Martin Powell, who contributed to some of the content, and also our former Chief Executive, James Nichols. All of this work would also not have been possible without the generosity of everyone who donated towards the production of this publication. So thank you so much to those of you who did, as well as the ongoing support of our funders. And a further massive thank you to the experts in their field who generously dedicated their time to read through our drafts and offer their valuable feedback as we developed this guide. Couple more. Thank you to Tim for the book design and to Halo for designing our packaging proposals, which we will be able to show you during this presentation. And an extra thank you to Drug Science's David Nutt and Dominique Mendiola at the Colorado Marijuana Enforcement Division for their feedback and support for this guide. Please do order a copy. It's now available online as a PDF, or you can also order it in hard copy. I'm sure Kate will put something in the chat for you to link through if you haven't done so already. For hard copy, postage and packaging, but we're shipping internationally. Right, so now that I've got that all out the way, I guess the first thing we need to address is why we decided to write this guide at all. So Steve, if you could put a slides up. Next one, please. This is our beautiful cover. For those working in the psychedelics field and beyond, the term psychedelic renaissance has probably become a term difficult to avoid, as the topic of psychedelics and their potential uses for society has become such a mainstream issue. Alongside a huge resurgence in research, there have been streams of articles, podcasts, and documentaries focusing very much particularly on their therapeutic or medical potentials, as well as the general fascination that we have as humans with these drugs. To add to this, the data we have shows that more and more people are using psychedelics, and rates have particularly increased over the last few years. However, from our perspective, the focus on the therapeutic or medical uses has led to other types of motivations for use being marginalised in the debate, in particular non-medical or recreational use. The focus on non-medical therapeutic uses is, of course, indeed driving both research, investment and public debate, but there is a risk that this could lead to a space in which legitimate access to psychedelics is narrowly confined to the medical space, and people who are using psychedelics for other reasons may end up being left out. So with this in mind, this guide to regulating psychedelics specifically aims to address this gap, space that is getting little attention. The issue of legalizing and regulating psychedelics for non-medical adult use, addressing some of the key issues along the way, including issues of corporate capture and social equity, indigenous rights, and the UN treaties and international treaty law. Could you do the next slide, please? With the aim to keep ourselves focused, we made the decision to narrow down our discussion to what are sometimes referred to as the classic psychedelics, so psilocybin, LSD, DMT, and mescaline. This distinction has been made based on their mode of action, as well as their risk profiles when using, which are slightly different to other drugs that sit in the broader category of hallucinogens, such as ketamine, MDMA, or 2CB. Though we hope that some of this thinking, as well as the work we have done on regulating stimulants, could go some way to informing regulatory proposals for these other drugs. It was a case of trying to make sure that we're not trying to overstretch ourselves in regulation. And of course, we're happy to have discussions about these other drugs at any other time. Now, I'm going to hand over to Steve to talk about how to think about regulating psychedelics.
Thank you, Esther. And I would just wanted to reiterate the thanks to all the Transform team and our expert reviewers and the crowdfunders for all the help we've had in producing this new book. I'm just going to do a briefly touch on some of the sort of practicalities and about how we think about regulating psychedelics and how we think about regulating drugs generally. And some of this, for people who've seen Transform's previous books, won't come as any great surprise, but I think it's worth just revisiting some of this just basic kind of regulatory theory before we zoom in on psychedelics specifically. The first thing to do, I think, is to be clear what it is we want our policy, our regulation to actually achieve. And it seems like an obvious thing to say in many ways, but when you think about the very narrowly framed goals of the war on drugs to kind of create a drug-free society and to deter drug use and prevent drug availability, I think it is worth reminding ourselves, why we are here, why are we even doing this, and just nailing down what our shared goals are. And they're not surprising or controversial, but it's worth just laying them out. We are talking about protecting and enhancing public health. We're talking about protecting and enhancing human rights. We're talking about trying to enhance security and development on international stage. We're particularly focused on protecting the health and well-being of vulnerable populations, including youth and people living in adults living in situations of vulnerability. And we are concerned with broader issues around equity and social justice, as well as a need to have cost-effective and evidence-based policy. Now, clearly, different stakeholders within the debate may have different priorities within there, and I think we'll come back to this in terms of how you balance sometimes conflicting priorities in policy thinking. But it's just worth saying what it is that we want and why, laying out why we're doing it. It's actually a good way to engage with defenders of the status quo, because you can, if you can identify shared goals with prohibitionists and people who defend the status quo and the sort of punitive paradigm, you can then say, well, is the status quo delivering on those things? Clearly it's not. Clearly it's not delivering a drug-free world or public health or social well-being or social justice or security and development. So in fact, things are moving in the opposite direction. So it's a good way to both critique the status quo, and it's a useful foundation for proposing alternatives, in this case a legally regulated model. Obviously, if once you've identified your goals, you need to have robust indicators to measure them so that we can tell whether we're actually achieving them or not. So it's obviously very important to have a solid, robust evaluative framework based on clear and measurable indicators, and that really does need to start preferably before the reform happens, so you can witness change and witness trends. But certainly any reform legislation needs to have a clear evaluative framework built into it. Moving on, one of the things that we tried to do was to look at who is using psychedelics, how are they using psychedelics, and why? What are their motivations for psychedelics? Because we need to know the answers to those questions if we're going to respond with a regulatory framework that deals with the reality of use as we find it. It was actually a surprisingly difficult task, because the sort of surveillance data on psychedelics is it's astonishingly shit. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime compiles data from around the world, and most countries either don't produce any data at all on psychedelics, or psychedelics are lumped in with a broader categorization of hallucinogens, which includes lots of other things, including ketamine and PCP and an array of other drugs often. So it's very difficult to get the kind of granular detail about individual psychedelics or just the classic psychedelics that we're looking at. There is some better data from North America and some European countries. And we were able to find some really good data from sources like the Global Drug Survey, which is an online self-selecting survey of about 100,000 people who use drugs. And they ask, it's a survey done by people who are actually interested in best practice and policy. And they have more granular data, and they ask people about their behaviors and their motivations and so on. So we've used a lot of the Global Drug Survey data in there. Another thing we did, because a basic principle of sound public health policymaking is to identify health risks, and then you target your policy interventions at those risk behaviors. Was we have kind of gone through and looked at what the risks associated with psychedelic use are, and what the benefits are as well, because obviously you need to look at both, and drug policy generally, including even alcohol policy, has often neglected to look at benefits of drug use. And if you're not looking at the benefits as well, you're really missing half of the story, and your policy will often be misaligned. So we've tried to look at both sides of that. We then looked at, we then basically looked at what regulatory tools are available. And again, it's worth being clear that, regulating risky products and behaviors is just one of those things that the governments around the world have been doing for generations, for centuries. And in many ways, they're very good at it. There's a whole body of regulatory scholarship around regulating risky products, whether it's pharmaceuticals, whether it's alcohol and tobacco, whether it's risky behaviors like driving or dangerous sports, or risky products. Regulation of risk is all around us. Whether it's in your plug sockets and electronics, whether it's in your fire retardant foam in the chairs you're sitting on. There is an enormous scholarship there, and really, to a significant extent, what Transform's done with this book and a lot of our work historically is just apply that regulatory logic and that regulatory scholarship to a set of products and behaviours that have historically existed outside of regulatory thinking because of the madness of the war on drugs. So it's basically just applying social policy thinking and logic to this novel set of drugs. And psychedelics, non-medical psychedelics in particular, even within the drugs field, even within the drugs regulation and reform field, have, as Esther noted, not received a great deal of attention. And that's one of the reasons we thought this book was needed. Moving on, monitoring and evaluation. I mean, I think that's self-explanatory. I've already touched on that. I mean, clearly policy needs to be based on evidence, and it needs to be flexible and able to evolve. We need to be able to acknowledge when policy is working, but also when it's not working, and be willing to change. We need to be flexible in a way that obviously prohibition and the war on drugs has singularly failed to be. The next point I want to make was really about getting the balance right, because as I alluded to in terms of the different stakeholders and different priorities, different groups within this debate will have different priorities. Even if we all agree that legalization regulation of some sort is needed, different groups have different priorities. So public health people obviously will prioritize public health, the police will prioritize crime reduction, business interests will prioritize profit, Treasury will prioritize tax revenue, and so on and so forth. And if any one of those groups dominates the discussion, their priorities will shape policy in a different way to if another party dominates. And so it's just really, really important that at this particular juncture, where we have basically a blank slate and we are, world building, as it were, that all the relevant stakeholders are at the table and they all have their say, but we prioritize the principles and the groups that we feel should be prioritised, that reflect our broader democratically agreed priorities. Now, that will differ between different people, probably on this, even here. I, for example, don't think that we should be prioritising, and Transform generally doesn't think that we should be prioritising business interests in terms of, shareholder profits, and that we should be prioritising social justice and public health and human rights and so on. But there are debates to be had here, and these things need to be thrashed out. There's a balance to be struck between state intervention and personal freedoms. To what extent is state intervention in the private sphere justified? These are really political and philosophical questions. There's no scientific answer to that, but these are things that we need to thrash out. Our general position is that the greater the risk associated with a particular product or behaviour, the greater the justification for some form of state intervention. So there is greater state intervention justified with more risky products. It's not too complicated, I don't think. There's obviously a balance to be struck between the need to eliminate the illegal market by making drugs affordable and available versus the need of public health to restrict availability and try and moderate use using regulatory controls on the market. Now, that is quite apparent with something like tobacco tax. Public health people saying put it up, the police may be saying put it down, because otherwise you're stimulating counterfeit market and smuggling and so on. It's perhaps less evident with psychedelics because the illegal market is less extensive than many other groups of drugs and is less associated with social harms. And the public health impacts of psychedelics similarly are relatively less than many other drugs. But still, these delicate balances, these trade-offs, these balancing acts that are intrinsic to all policymaking actually are still present. Perhaps most critically, this issue of profit motivations versus public good. And we'll come back to that, I think, in the discussion on corporate capture. But generally speaking, there is a profound risk that if profit dominates policy making and regulatory design, other externalities, be it public health or social justice or environmental issues, can get lost or negated. Moving on to psychedelic risks and benefits and the issues of psychedelic exceptionalism. Looking at psychedelic risks, they are in the most general broad terms, they are really quite unusual. I mean, if you look historically at the psychedelic risks that have dominated the public discourse in terms of the threat of drugs and the war on drugs, to use the sort of stigmatizing terms of the past, death, addiction and madness are kind of the three biggies that have always dominated the discourse. Or overdose, issues of dependence or substance use disorder, and mental health issues, to use more up-to-date, more appropriate language. But notably with psychedelics, the risks of overdose and dependence are either very low or almost entirely absent. That you really just don't get overdose deaths in the same way you do with most other groups of drugs, perhaps bar cannabis. But certainly things like opioids and stimulants that are often associated with overdose, and the classic sort of substance use disorder, dependence, patterns of compulsive use, whatever language, addiction, whatever language that you choose to use, they just aren't really associated with psychedelics. Sure, there are people who cane loads of psychedelics, and you hear stories about I took LSD every day for a year and all this sort of thing, but generally they are not associated with the same sort of patterns of compulsive long-term use. People don't seem to use psychedelics to escape from their lives or as a form of self-medication in the same way that they do with opioids. People don't sort of self-medicate for trauma in the same way. And even NIDA, for example, says that psychedelics, that the LSD is not associated with addiction. But having said that, psychedelics clearly are not entirely risk-free. There are issues around mental health, and I'm not going to go into this. I'm not going to do a sort of depressing list of all the risks of psychedelics, but we do go into it in more detail in the book. So please do look at that. But there are issues around certain mental use of psychedelics with certain mental health vulnerabilities. There are issues around bad trips and negative experiences. These can sometimes continue after initial intoxication has passed, and sometimes can be longer term and distressing. There's a syndrome called HPPD, which is it's rare, but it's certainly a thing. There are issues of harms that can happen whilst you're under the influence, like if you're driving, for example. Occasionally there have been issues of suicide or violence. And there are issues around contraindications of using psychedelics with other drugs, certain psychedelics and SSRIs, for example. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but just to say that there are risks and we need to be mindful of them. We need to identify them, and they need to inform our regulatory response in terms of mitigating those risks. Clearly, risks are also, we need to be very careful about making generalizations like saying psychedelics are less risky than X, Y, Z, because clearly the risks of an individual to any particular individual are enormously varied depending on their using behaviors, the dosage, the frequency of use, their individual health vulnerabilities, their mental health issues, where they're using, how they're using, are they using with other drugs, and so on. So we just need to be a bit careful about making generalizations. And on that note, I'm going to make a big generalization, which is that generally speaking, the overall risk profile of psychedelics is generally lower than many other drugs or drug groupings, such as alcohol or tobacco or opioids or stimulants. But again, I do caution about this risk of generalizations, and there are risk behaviors, and there are particularly for certain vulnerable individuals associated with psychedelics. But one of the problems with this arguably unique risk profile, this unique risk-benefit profile of psychedelics, because we do get a lot of stories about how people benefit from psychedelics, and it brings positive things to their lives, and it can bring positive things to communities. This unusually positive risk-benefit balance has sometimes sort of trickled into a sense of psychedelic exceptionalism, that psychedelics are uniquely positive and they are exceptional amongst drugs. And it's a view that's often enhanced by people who have had amazing experiences with psychedelics. Spiritual revelations, personal benefits, it's helped their mental health or whatever it is. And people can sometimes evangelize about their psychedelic use. And often it's people who have access, often quite privileged people, privileged white people, who have access to political and media capital. And there is this creeping sense that somehow psychedelics are different to other drugs and they should be subject to different approaches in policy and law. Our view is, if you're going to ask, are psychedelics a special case? The answer is no. Even though they have their own unique profile and their unique culture, they are drugs like all other drugs, and the logic of decriminalization and the logic of regulation applies to all drugs. In fact, I would go further and say, from a pragmatic public health point of view, it's the drugs that are the most risky, that are probably should be legalized and regulated first. If there is going to be a queue, if we are going to do it first, we should do the ones where there is the biggest public and social benefits to regulation. And given so many of the harms associated with, for example, injected opioid use are associated with prohibition, it kind of makes sense to do those first. Realistically, that's not going to happen. Obviously, to a degree, cannabis is already being legalized first, and there's cannabis exceptionalism is its own thing. It's politically easier, arguably, to legalize and regulate drugs that are seen as less threatening publicly, are perceived as safer. It's probably going to happen anyway. So even if it's not, pragmatically or ethically the right thing to do, it's probably going to happen. In fact, it is already happening, that psychedelics is probably going to be the next group of drugs to be legalized and regulated after cannabis. And I just think, given that reality, we need to be mindful and not play into this psychedelic exceptionalism discourse. In fact, we need to challenge it, and we need to use the successes of cannabis and psychedelics regulation to leverage wider reform with regards other drugs. Anyway, workshopping some of this regulatory theory, looking at the options, looking at the behaviours, looking at the risks, looking at who's using and so on, looking at the regulatory tools we have, and growing out of some of our other work on cannabis and stimulants. We've come up with a sort of 4-tiered model for regulating psychedelics, which we hope can accommodate the broad spectrum of psychedelic using cultures, of psychedelic products, and of different psychedelic cultures. And I think, without further ado, I'm going to pass back to Esther, who is going to kick off by explaining the first two, and then I'll pick up for 3 and 4.
Thank you. So I'm only going to do this in brief. Obviously, go and visit our online publication to look at it in more detail. First, I need to open with key principle in any discussions of legally regulating drugs, and in fact, drug reform generally, is that ending the criminalization of people who use drugs is a vital precondition for a meaningful public health and rights-based response. In the guide, we highlight the key principles for the best standard of decriminalization, and I direct you there for more detail. A legally regulated market must therefore be accompanied by comprehensive decriminalization. And this principle is what upholds the first model, which we propose, which is private use, including home cultivation, foraging, and not-for-profit sharing. This model exists based on the premise that much psychedelic use exists beyond the realm of formal regulation. And to that end, this model is there to accommodate a large majority of that use. A decriminalized model based on private use and so on would include removing criminal sanctions for foraging, small-scale cultivation of plant-based psychedelics for personal use, as well as small-scale not-for-profit sharing. Of course, the decriminalization principle would also apply for LSD, though we have highlighted specifically plant-based psychedelics around cultivation and foraging, as well as removing criminal sanctions for people who use psychedelics. By removing the sanctions for not-for-profit sharing, this aims to establish an additional, though perhaps more limited, route to access to plant-based psychedelics, in particular, that are beyond our following models that we discuss around social clubs and retail access. The key aim within this, there will be a key aim of any personal use and possession threshold would just be to limit potential sales for profit. And we expect psilocybin mushrooms are likely to make up the majority of cultivation and foraging, although individuals will seek to cultivate other plant-based psychedelics, including DMT-containing plants and cacti for mescaline use. To move on to the not-for-profit association model, we propose this model based on the cannabis social clubs that have been pioneered in Spain. Personal possession and cultivation allowances under a decriminalization model were stretched here to include collective growing and sharing within the clubs. Although this is a relatively new and evolving model, there are several examples of established practices in Spain, Uruguay, Malta, and other jurisdictions. The cannabis social club model brings specific benefits to members who have access to legal supply within a community-based environment. Within this, we propose that product supply limited to plant-based psychedelics, creating a centralized regulatory authority which licenses these associations. Supply is only allowed to association members, and membership numbers should be limited, which is a practice that has been implemented in Malta and Uruguay. Clubs could apply for supervised or guided use licenses, which Steve will get onto describing. And we have also added a provision for granting import licenses where clubs may intend to use ayahuasca under supervised or guided use settings. So that is a very quick run through, but there's far more detail in the book. And then back to you, Steve, to explain the other two.
Thanks, Esther. Yeah, the third model, and apologies for that, should be a 3, not a 1. That's my fault. Any typos are my fault. Esther is entirely blameless. The third model is basically a regulated retail model. So I think it's quite similar really to what we have, for example, with retail cannabis in some of the provinces in Canada. Perhaps Quebec would be a good example. It's adult only sales for personal use. It's quality control products, both plant and synthetic. You'd have packing controls. There's an example of some packaging we've mocked up here for magic mushrooms. The packaging, I think you can see it looks quite pharmaceutical. And that's not because we're trying to look like pharmaceuticals. It's just that if you strip back to the basic information and remove branding and marketing, this is kind of what you get. It's just plain with health warnings, basic information, dosage information, name of the product, and you know, if you take away all the marketing and branding information, you basically get something that looks kind of like pharmaceuticals, because that's what pharmaceuticals do as well. Some people think this is a bit churlish and miserable. Our thing was that as soon as you start, and some people have also said when we showed them this, you know, that's going to give people a bad trip if it all looks pharmaceutical. Well, our thing was that if you start to put any design elements on it, you're going to influence people's experience, set and setting and mindset and so on in a different way. So let's just keep it as simple and functional as possible. And of course, when you get these products, you can always take them out and put them in your embroidered, you know, tripper bag or something if you want to. You don't have to leave them in the pharmaceutical packaging. This is a point of sale thing, and we've done packaging for mescaline and LSD pills as well. As Esther's been saying, there's a load more detail on this. This section on regulated retail models is about 30 or 40 pages in the book. It goes into a lot of detail on licensing of vendors, packaging, product controls, a whole bunch of stuff, you know, hours of opening, all of this sort of stuff. We go into a lot more detail. Generally, we think there shouldn't be any marketing or branding. We don't think that these should be conventional commercial products. We've come down fairly hard against the idea of edibles. Generally, it just seems not edibles per se, but particularly edibles that look like sweets. You know, if you want to, if you really like sweets, just buy some fucking Haribo. Don't put drugs in them. It just seems like it's just a really bad idea. You're just asking for trouble. You know, just no edibles. It just seems like a terrible idea. No. I mean, when I say, I mean infused edibles that look like attractive children's snacks. It's a terrible idea for obvious reasons. Let's just not go there. It's causing lots of problems with cannabis infused edibles. And it just no, let's just not go there with psychedelics. The idea of having, you know, LSD gummies lying around, it's sort of an order of magnitude worse than cannabis infused gummies. So we think that's a really bad idea. We've explored options for whether you could have a state monopoly retail, a bit like they do with alcohol in some of the Scandi countries, a bit like they do with cannabis in Quebec. We're not saying it's an absolute necessity, as we have done with, for example, some regulated stimulants, but it's certainly an option, and in public health terms quite an attractive one, because it removes some of the commercial incentives for sort of profit-making corporations and some of the problems that can also bring. The final model is regulated commercial, supervised use, or guided experiences. So this is the kind of retreat model or guided use model. Obviously, there's going to be lessons learned from traditional and ceremonial use about sort of, preparing and respectful use, respecting the power of some of these substances. And we've sort of tried to draw on some of that traditional wisdom and to inform what we've written about this. We think that there is an issue, a duty of care for people who are having guided experiences that really requires properly trained and licensed practitioners administering and supervising this kind of use. And it really does need to take place within an appropriately regulated framework. There are clear risks for people participating in supervised use. There's risks of exploitation. There are safety issues. People need to know that if something goes wrong, that there will be someone there who is trained to look after and support them or provide emergency care if necessary. We need to avoid people making false medical claims and other forms of abuse and exploitation that have unfortunately occasionally been issues with supervised use. The key, obviously, is ensuring the welfare of the participants, and there does need to be accountability and liability for service providers. And I think you do need an institutional framework to oversee these sorts of services if that is to exist and be appropriately enforced. One of the other issues that we've clocked is this idea of screening participants for vulnerabilities. Not everybody should or is appropriate for these sorts of experiences, and we do need to have a screening process so that people who do have certain vulnerabilities get the appropriate warnings and are potentially filtered out. So we've gone into more details. Is that a lot of our work on this was informed by a really good paper by Mark Hayden, Ken Tupper. But yeah, I mean, as with all of these, we've gone into a lot more detail in the book, so please do go and check it out. So moving on, back to you, Esther.
Thank you. So one of the key elements of any new emerging market is that it's an opportunity to be ambitious about how you set it out. And this is as much the case for the legalization and regulation of psychedelics and whatever market we come up with through policy making and design. The key aspect that needs to be embedded is the principles of social justice and equity. These principles have been often too absent or undermined, both in unregulated as well as regulated markets. And strong commitment to these principles are needed to avoid the risk of further entrenching inequalities via an emerging market, such as psychedelics market. People from minoritized groups are at risk of being excluded from policy-making decisions, facing barriers to taking part and benefiting from an emerging psychedelics market from the retail side, as well as greater barriers in access to the psychedelics in the emerging market. So policymakers should aim to establish a market which is both equitable and just, whilst also repairing the harms of so-called war on drugs. There are key elements that we've identified in achieving this, which we explore in the guide, which include preventing the emergence of monopolies and oligopolies in order to prevent the market or regulatory capture by a small number of actors. And this is vital to ensuring a diverse market. Implementing equity programs that facilitate and empower historically marginalized and impacted communities to meaningfully participate in, shape policy and regulatory frameworks. Using market surplus to reinvest into those marginalized communities. We've already seen that this has happened with legally regulated cannabis markets, particularly in the US. For example, New York State have 40% of its tax revenues redirected into drug service provision and wider social programs. And in New Jersey, this figure is 70%. So this is something that should absolutely be foundational principles of a psychedelics market for non-medical use. And the final one is ensuring justice for Indigenous communities and their relationships with psychedelics. So I'm just going to do a little overview of each one of these. See if you could just flip the slide, that would be fab. Thank you. So, okay, as we have mentioned several times, preventing corporate capture is an absolute key, and other industries, including alcohol, tobacco, as well as new legal cannabis markets, have demonstrated the risks and the costs of allowing market consolidation, emergence of power, corporate grips on the market. A vast amount of speculative investor capital is already flowing into the psychedelics market, and therefore policy design must be alive to this risk and ensure any future regulatory frameworks for psychedelics are designed to prevent the emergence of these monopolies and the potential capture. We already have a huge wealth of learning on anti-monopoly measures which can be implemented, and just a couple of these include limiting the number of production or retail licenses available to one entity, preventing licenses for companies which are at risk due to their strong position to enter the market, for example, medical, psychedelic industry, pharmaceuticals, or companies involved in other drug production, and also the support and establishment of non-commercial market models can also be an important tool to have alternative access to commercial retail. Next slide. In terms of equity programs, psychedelic reforms should look to some of the good examples of community-led work in emerging cannabis markets. And so much of this work that we have done is already based on some of that. There are several elements that can be embedded in licensing frameworks for psychedelic cultivation and production, retail, and supervised and guided use. And we believe equity programs should be available across all spectrums of these models so that social justice and equity is prioritized. Equity programs should include removal of financial barriers for equity applicants, including fees for applications, licensing, and other associated costs, prioritize equity applicants in the licensing process, provide technical assistance and wraparound benefits, including legal and account services, and provision of workforce and development training. All of these are extremely vital, but they must also be underpinned by a continuous review of these programs to ensure that they are achieving their stated outcomes, and a room created to be able to adjust and respond to any issues to ensure that the potential of these programs are maximized. So finally, to protection for religious and indigenous uses. So firstly, we make very clear in the beginning of our guide that as Transform, in our social context as a wise organisation based in the UK, we are not touching upon the regulation framework of any religious or indigenous use. However, as these communities risk being some of the most impacted by an emerging psychedelics market and already are experiencing this, it's important to ensure that cultural sensitivity and reparatory justice for Indigenous communities is embedded into policy reforms. The right of religious and Indigenous communities to freedom of belief and practice must be secured and not be encroached upon by regulatory frameworks for other forms of access at all. Such practices have frequently been undermined, stigmatized, and in many cases criminalized. We, in the book, do highlight the international guidelines on human rights and drug policy, which provide more detail on what such protections should look like. However, these guidelines, compiled by a series of international organizations, including the UN Development Programme, WHO, etc., they have compiled this, but they are not representing a formal legal mechanism. This means there are very limited international legal protections for specifically Indigenous communities that exist at UN level, and those that do exist are very inadequate. This makes the need for state level exemptions and protections far more necessary. We have drawn attention to some of these exemptions that exist at a domestic level, including the permitted use of peyote cactus by members of the Native American Church in the United States, as well as religious exemptions existing in the US and Canada for the, I'm so sorry for my pronunciation, the União do Vegetal, a church which imports ayahuasca for its use in ceremonies. This is an element that we've explored as a proposal, but we really recognize that actually these decisions need to be made on the ground by people affected in their communities and their respective legal mechanisms. In regards to justice for Indigenous communities, specifically regarding exploitation or appropriation of traditional psychedelic practices, and then the potential exclusion from the benefits of psychedelic reforms, we really urge for policy to be nuanced and Indigenous-led. The lack of participation and inclusion of members of Indigenous communities within academic research already highlights the absolute urgency of this. Within the guide, we highlight some of the existing work already being done that policymakers should be aware of, including organisations promoting benefit sharing. The benefit sharing is the idea of giving a portion of advantages or profits that are gained by corporations from the use of genetic resources or traditional knowledge to Indigenous communities in order to achieve justice in exchange for reforms that are benefiting companies making money elsewhere. I summarize all of that with recognizing that this is a very complex issue and that there is obviously no singular Indigenous community, and that this is an opportunity for people to be listened to and to open up dialogue that is non-extractive and giving the voice to the individuals who are most impacted. I believe Steve will just do a bit on the UN treaties now.
Yeah, very briefly, because we're talking too much and running over, predictably enough. I just think it's really important for people to know that a lot of the issues that have appeared with cannabis around the fact that, you know, cannabis for non-medical use is technically non-compliant with the UN Convention obligations that countries, member states have all ratified. So these are challenges that Uruguay and Canada and currently EU countries and others are bumping up against. A lot of these don't apply to certain elements of psychedelics. If you look at this quote here, this is from the commentary on the 1971 UN Drug Treaty that incorporates the classic psychedelics. It says the cultivation of plants from which psychotropic substances, which is just a posh phrase for drugs, are obtained is not controlled by the Vienna Convention. That's the 1971 convention. Neither the crown, fruit, mezcal button of the peyote cactus, nor the roots of the plant, nor the psilocybin mushrooms themselves are included in Schedule 1, but only their respective principles, mescaline, DMT, and psilocybin. So what that means is that the plants themselves are not covered by the prohibitions under the treaties. And if there was any a doubt about that, I mean, only the extracted or synthetic versions of the drugs are included. If there's any doubt, this is from 2019. This is UNODC World Drug Report. For the hallucinogens that are under international control, the 1971 Convention does not cover the plants or plant material from which these substances can be extracted. As an example, psilocybin is under international control, but the mushroom Psilocybin mexicana, from which it is extracted, is not. Nevertheless, national legislation of many countries, both psychoactive substances and the plant material from which substances are extracted, are controlled. So what they're saying is that they're not banned. The plants aren't banned under the treaties, only the extracted drugs. But some countries have banned them anyway. In fact, most countries have banned them anyway, but not actually all. So just as a final note, I just think it's really important for people to understand that psychedelic reforms, this one particular obstacle of the UN treaties, at least as far as it concerns plant-based psychedelics or fungi-based psychedelics, if you're going to be pedantic, do not engage with the treaties. And there is no reason why you can't have a legally regulated market for plant-based psychedelics. LSD, you're out of luck, but the plant-based psychedelics, at least, there's no reason why you can't have them, and you're not going to be in violation of the treaties. And on that bombshell, just because we do like to point that out, just because it seems like a lot of people are just not aware of this, and that, you know, people do worry about the treaties, not so much in the US, but other countries. It's not necessarily going to be an issue for psychedelics, at least as far as plant-based psychedelics like magic mushrooms are concerned. And I think we'll probably end there. Please do read it, do share your thoughts with us. We really are interested in people's feedback and thoughts. Do share it with your networks. If there are podcasts or blogs or media or journalists you think might be interested, please do point them our way. We do want to get it out there. If there are policymakers who are looking at this, discussing this, if it comes up, please do send them. I mean, we have evolved these books. Our cannabis book's on its 3rd edition, so these are, I hope, in some ways living documents. Maybe in a few years, when we've got a bit more knowledge and experience from some of the emerging psychedelic regulation models in Colorado and Oregon and Jamaica and elsewhere, maybe we can do a 2nd edition. So this is a living document. It's an active debate. We're just trying to get this debate rolling, and hopefully this book is going to be helpful for that. Please do buy a copy. Obviously you can download and read it for free, and I hope you will. Please do buy a copy. That would help us support us. And if you happen to be fabulously wealthy, or even have any spare coins lying around in your pocket, please do make a donation to Transform, because we are not funded by industry. We are a registered charity. We can't do this work without your support. So please do, if you like what we're doing, please do support us. Have I missed anything out, Esther?
I think you've covered it all. I just reiterate that point. Please do support us in whichever way you can. Then thank you for joining.